object in life was to be Diana. That has always been her passion.
And her idea of elegance is phony to the nth degree.
The obvious reality that my sister wasn't around anymore, and I wanted to speak for her honestly and truly and fully. And that was it, really. That's all I tried to do. Wonderful person we just lost. And if in comparison to that, other people felt badly about it, well, that was really not my issue. I was trying to just be loyal to Diana.
There is a particular kind of silence that carries more weight than any statement, and for 30 years, one man in Northamptonshire has mastered it completely. Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, has spent 3 decades saying almost nothing in public about his sister. No memoir, no tell-all interview, no talk show appearance to set the record straight. Just a locked gate at Althorpe and a reputation for guarding his sister's memory like a man guarding the last unopened room in a house everyone else has already ransacked. So when word began circulating among royal commentators that Spencer had reportedly turned down a major proposal involving Diana's legacy and that the fallout touched not just Buckingham Palace but Harry and Meghan's operation in Montecito, it landed differently than most royal gossip does. This wasn't a story about a feud or a leaked text message. According to the accounts now circulating among royal watchers, this was about something Spencer has protected more fiercely than anything else: control over how the real Diana, the unguarded one, gets remembered. To understand why a quiet refusal from a man who almost never speaks could ripple this far, you have to go back to where his silence actually started. On September 6, 1997, in front of an estimated worldwide television audience of close to 2 billion people, a young Charles Spencer stood at the lectern in Westminster Abbey and delivered what remains one of the most quoted eulogies in modern royal history. He spoke about his sister's laughter, her instinct for genuine compassion, and the very British girl he had grown up alongside. Then came the line that everyone remembers, a promise, delivered essentially straight at the royal family's seated feet away, that Diana's blood relatives would do everything possible to protect her sons from what he described as the forces that had hounded and, in his view, ultimately destroyed her. It was a bold thing to say inside that building, to that audience, on that day. And then, notably, he mostly disappeared from public life. He gave interviews rarely, always guardedly. He didn't sell access to Althorpe's private archive of home movies and letters. He didn't shop a book. In an era when practically everyone with a connection to a famous story eventually cashes it in, Charles Spencer became known for the opposite instinct, for saying no, repeatedly, to enormous sums of money and enormous cultural pressure in order to keep something of his sister private. That's the context that makes the more recent reporting resonate. A man who has said no for 30 straight years reportedly said no again, but this time the ask and the fallout allegedly reached all the way to California. Long before any documentary proposal, there was jewelry. At the royal wedding reception in May 2018, Meghan Markle wore Diana's aquamarine ring, a piece instantly recognizable to anyone who followed Diana's story. Many observers read it as touching a new member of the family honoring the mother her husband had lost. In the years since, other pieces reportedly associated with Diana have appeared on Meghan at high-visibility public moments: earrings, a watch, bracelets, always timed to occasions where photographers were guaranteed to be present. None of this, on its own, proves anything beyond what it looks like on the surface: a woman choosing to honor her late mother-in-law. Grief and tribute are complicated, and marrying into a family this scrutinized comes with its own strange pressures. But according to people who track this kind of detail closely, repetition changes how something reads. Once looks like sentiment. Repeated, at moments engineered for maximum coverage, some royal watchers argue it starts to look less like memory and more like branding. Whether or not that's a fair read, it's reportedly the read that stuck with the man who has spent 30 years cataloging every use of his sister's image. Then came something commentators have compared, structurally, to Diana's own most famous media moment. When the Oprah interview aired in March 2021, much of the conversation afterward focused on the specific claims made inside it. But a smaller, quieter conversation one that reportedly mattered enormously to Charles Spencer was about the shape of the thing. A royal-adjacent woman, isolated inside an institution she said had failed to protect her, going over its head directly to the public through one trusted, sympathetic interviewer. That structure is almost identical to Diana's landmark 1995 Panorama interview, the same basic architecture of a wife who felt unheard by the family she'd married into, choosing to bypass every internal channel and speak straight to the nation. The difference, and it's a significant one, is context. Diana gave her interview from inside the system, with nowhere else to turn and genuinely something to lose. The 2021 interview was filmed after the exit from California, with a streaming deal already forming around it. Whatever else is true about it, one version was a woman in crisis. The other was, by any reasonable definition, already a launch. For Charles Spencer, according to people close to the family, watching that echo unfold wasn't just uncomfortable, it touched something far more personal than jewelry ever could. And that's where this story gets genuinely complicated, because of a fact that doesn't get mentioned nearly often enough. It is a matter of public record, confirmed by a formal UK government inquiry led by Lord Dyson, that Charles Spencer was the person who first connected Diana to journalist Martin Bashir, the man behind that 1995 Panorama interview. Spencer, by his own account, believed he was helping his sister. He had been shown documents suggesting people close to her were being secretly paid to spy on her, evidence he later learned had been fabricated using fake bank statements designed specifically to convince a frightened, isolated woman that she couldn't trust anyone around her. The Dyson inquiry concluded that those forged documents were used to gain Diana's trust and secure the interview. The BBC later issued a formal apology to Charles Spencer directly, acknowledging that he had been deceived. It's a detail that reframes everything else about the man. He spent his adult life believing he was Diana's protector, stood in front of 2 billion people, and promised to shield her legacy, and then learned, years later, that he had unknowingly helped open the door to the most invasive media moment of her life. Seen through that lens, Spencer's decades of silence stop looking like aristocratic aloofness and start looking like something closer to penance. The sealed archive, the refusal to sell access, Diana's burial on the private island at Althorpe rather than anywhere more accessible. Every one of those choices reads differently once you know that the man making them spent years carrying the knowledge that he'd been manipulated into contributing to his sister's worst public exposure. Whatever else people think of him, it's hard to deny he's spent 30 years trying to make sure nothing like that ever happens to her again. Which brings us to the proposal that, according to recent reporting, finally tested that resolved directly the concept, as described by people familiar with the pitch, was a major anniversary documentary planned around 2027, 30 years since the Paris crash, described internally as a definitive, feature-length project fronted by one of Diana's sons. On paper, it's the kind of project streaming platforms dream about, a story the public has never stopped being fascinated by, told with apparent family cooperation. But the reported ask was the issue. Not old footage already circulating for decades, but the real archive, the private family recordings, personal letters, and unpublished photographs that have never been shown publicly. Plus, access to Althorpe itself, including the island where Diana is buried. And, according to people familiar with the pitch, there was one more element that reportedly made the proposal land very differently with Spencer than any previous request. Language positioning Meghan as a kind of spiritual successor to Diana's story, drawing an explicit line between the two women's experiences with the institution. Whether that framing was ever meant, that literally is genuinely unclear, and it's worth being skeptical of any account that claims total certainty about a private pitch meeting. But by the reporting that has circulated since, Spencer's response was immediate and total. No access to the archive, no use of the island, no participation, and notably, he didn't explain himself publicly. No statement, no interview about the decision itself, just a closed door, which, for a man whose public silence has become its own kind of statement, apparently spoke plenty loudly on its own. Royal commentators who picked up on this story didn't frame it as a simple business deal falling apart. They framed it as something closer to a verdict, and the reasoning is worth sitting with. Prince William, by most accounts, has been privately uncomfortable for years with how his mother's story keeps getting repackaged commercially. But William can't say so publicly without it reading as the institution trying to control the narrative, again, the exact dynamic Diana spent her life pushing back against. Any objection from the palace gets filtered through that lens, no matter how sincere it is. Charles Spencer doesn't have that problem. He holds no official role, has nothing to protect institutionally, and has spent 30 years demonstrating he isn't interested in profiting from his sister's story. When he says no, it can't be dismissed as palace damage control, because he isn't the palace. That's reportedly part of why commentators reacted the way they did, not because the refusal itself was shocking, but because it landed as the one objection in this entire saga that nobody could spin as institutional self-interest. To understand why this reported refusal mattered so much to the Sussex side of the story, it helps to look at where their media business actually stood heading into 2026. Their lifestyle-focused streaming projects had, by most independent accounts, landed with a fairly muted critical reception reviews across a wide range of outlets, from generally sympathetic to openly skeptical, converged on similar disappointment, which is unusual in an industry where opinions on this couple normally split sharply along predictable lines. Meanwhile, other ventures, a food and lifestyle brand, a music deal, had reportedly stalled or quietly wound down. Set against that backdrop, a definitive Diana anniversary documentary wasn't just another project. It would have been, by most measures, the single most valuable piece of content available to that operation, arguably more valuable than anything else on the table. And, according to the reporting, it never got past the pitch stage because the person holding the actual keys to that archive said no. Two legitimate claims. Pulling in opposite directions here's where the story resists a tidy conclusion, and it's worth resisting the urge to pick a clean villain. There is a genuinely strong case for what Spencer reportedly did. Diana's story has been retold, dramatized, and monetized for almost 30 years, another major documentary, especially one built around positioning a successor to her story, risks turning her actual death into a promotional beat for someone else's brand. The anniversary of her death arguably deserves quiet reflection more than a premiere date. But there's an equally real counterargument, and it deserves just as much weight. Harry was a child when he lost his mother walking beside her through hospitals and shelters, and then losing her suddenly at 15. He grew up inside the very institution his uncle warned about from that same Abbey lectern. His connection to Diana's story isn't borrowed from anyone, it's his own lived experience, and no external archive holder, however well-intentioned, can hand him back what it actually felt like to be her son. His claim to that story is not the same kind of claim a production company has, and treating it identically may be its own kind of unfairness. Both of those things can be true simultaneously, and honestly, they probably are. If there's a genuine antagonist anywhere in this story, it isn't Spencer, and it isn't Harry. It's an industry that has learned to treat grief itself as a licensable asset, packaging private pain into content calendars regardless of who it belongs to. According to people who follow the family closely, there may be some very cautious, limited appetite for a thaw between the palace and Harry personally. That appetite reportedly does not extend nearly as far where Meghan is concerned, and the reason given is almost always the same single word: trust. The family's stated worry isn't about criticism or public statements, it's about the fear that any private moment of reconciliation eventually resurfaces somewhere as content. So the gate at Althorpe stays closed, not because Charles Spencer sees himself as anyone's obstacle, but because he has decided, with remarkable consistency for 30 years, exactly what his job is. He said it himself, in front of 2 billion people in 1997, protect Diana. In 2026, protecting her apparently means protecting the parts of her the world has never gotten to consume, even if that means disappointing the son, who arguably has the most legitimate claim of anyone to tell her story. There's no clean answer to who's right here. And anyone offering you one with total confidence probably hasn't sat with the full weight of it. What seems true is this: a man who has said almost nothing publicly for 3 decades reportedly said no one more time, quietly, without explanation, and precisely because of how rarely he speaks, it was heard louder than almost anything else in this long, strange story. If you have a take on where the line